Part 1: The Shattered Illusion. It began as a quiet evening, one of those mundane midweek nights when nothing seemed significant. Ethan was in the shower, and I was curled up on the couch with my phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media. The sound of water rushing in the background was comforting in its familiarity. To the outside world, we probably looked like the picture-perfect couple: 7 years of marriage, a cozy home, and a life that, while not extraordinary, was solid. But lately something had felt off. First, I chalked it up to stress. Ethan's job had him traveling more, coming home late, and often glued to his phone even during dinner. He brushed off my concerns with a tired smile and vague reassurances about deadlines and work politics. I wanted to believe him. But then there were the little things: how he'd tilt his screen away when I walked into the room or excuse himself to take calls outside. My gut whispered that something wasn't right, but I silenced it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. That night, though, the whisper became a roar. Ethan had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. It wasn't unusual. He wasn't the type to obsessively clutch his phone. But this time, I noticed the screen light up with a notification. I wasn't planning to snoop, I swear I wasn't. I even tried to look away, but my eyes betrayed me. A message previewed at the top of the screen, and my heart immediately skipped a beat. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," winking-faced. I froze. My pulse quickened and my mind raced to make sense of what I'd just read. Surely it was a joke, or a message from someone who'd mistaken Ethan for someone else, right? But then why would they end it with that flirty wink? My stomach churned as I picked up the phone. It unlocked without a password. That was the first red flag. Ethan had always been protective of his privacy, insisting on a passcode even for safety reasons. Why had he left it unprotected now? Did he think I wouldn't dare to look? My hands trembled as I opened the messaging app. I told myself I'd find nothing, maybe a misplaced text from a coworker or a misunderstanding. But what I found was far worse. The thread was filled with messages between Ethan and someone named Lily. Their conversation was casual at first glance, but the undertone was unmistakably intimate. Inside jokes, shared emojis, and a playful banter that I hadn't seen in our own conversations for years. "Tomorrow at 7 work for you? I'll bring the wine, you bring that gorgeous smile, winking face. Stop it. You're making me blush, lol. Can't wait, face blowing x." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, the kind that spread slowly, leaving you gasping for air. My stomach turned to lead as I scrolled further. The texts weren't just friendly. They were a prelude to something far more personal. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the fact that they dripped with effort, the kind Ethan used to put into us. He'd always been so attentive when we first met, sending me flirty texts during meetings, planning surprise dates. Seeing that same energy now directed at someone else was like being slapped with a memory of what we'd lost. I heard the shower turn off and panic gripped me. My heart thudded against my ribcage as I scrambled to put the phone back exactly where he'd left it. As I sank into the couch, my hands clammy and my breathing shallow, Ethan stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist. He smiled, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "What are you up to?" he asked casually, rubbing his hair dry with another towel. "Oh, nothing much," I replied, forcing a tight smile. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too hollow. But inside I was anything but calm. I wasn't sure what I'd just uncovered, but I knew one thing for certain. Life as I knew it was about to change. Part 2: The Confrontation. The rest of the evening passed in an agonizing blur. I couldn't look at Ethan the same way. Every time he laughed at the TV or leaned over to kiss me goodnight, I felt the bile rise in my throat. His touch, once so familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, almost repulsive. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I needed time to process, to figure out how I was going to confront him without breaking apart myself in the process. I barely slept that night. I lay beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, while my mind raced through scenarios. What if I was wrong? What if it was innocent? But the messages, those weren't innocent. No one sends heart emojis and winks to a friend. By morning I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this fester and eat me alive. I needed answers, no matter how much they might hurt. The opportunity came that evening. Ethan was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his laptop while I stood in the kitchen, holding his phone in my hand. My heart pounded like a drumbeat in my ears, but I steeled myself and walked into the room. "Ethan," I said, my voice calm but firm. He looked up, startled by my tone. "Yeah." I tossed the phone onto the coffee table in front of him. "Care to explain this?" His eyes darted to the phone, and for a split second I saw it, a flicker of panic. It was brief, so fleeting that if I hadn't been looking for it I might have missed it. But it was there, and it told me everything I needed to know. "Explain what?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, trying to play it cool. I folded my arms, my voice rising slightly. "Don't play dumb, Ethan. Who is Lily? And why is she texting you about wine and your gorgeous smile?" He opened his mouth to speak but faltered. I watched as he scrambled for words, his confidence slipping. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice defensive. "Then tell me what it is." I snapped, the dam of my composure beginning to break. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're planning a romantic night with another woman while your wife sits at home, oblivious." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, she's just a friend from work. We're working on a project together and—" "Cut the crap," I interrupted, my voice shaking now. "Friends from work don't text like this. Friends from work don't bring wine and talk about your smile. Do you think I'm stupid?" His face twisted, frustration flashing in his eyes. "You're overreacting," he said, his tone sharper now. "It's harmless, okay? We were just joking around. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Harmless," I repeated, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Do you even hear yourself? You're calling this harmless while I sit here questioning everything about our marriage." Ethan stood, his expression hardening. "You went through my phone," he accused, deflecting. "That's a violation of my privacy, Claire. Do you know how messed up that is?" "Oh, don't you dare turn this around on me." I shot back, my anger now burning hot. "Your privacy? Are you seriously trying to make this about my invasion of your privacy, while you're sneaking around behind my back?" "I wasn't sneaking around," he yelled, throwing his hands in the air. I stepped closer, pointing a finger at him. "Then why didn't you tell me about her? Why didn't you mention these little texts? Why did you hide it if it's so innocent?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with anger. But there was something else there, too. Guilt. "I'm giving you one chance, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling with both rage and heartbreak. "One chance to tell me the truth. If you lie to me again, we're done." He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the cracks in his facade. But instead of coming clean, he shook his head and muttered, "You're being ridiculous." That was it. That was the breaking point. "Get out," I said quietly. His head snapped up. "What?" I said, "Get out," I repeated louder this time. "Pack your things and leave. You disrespected me, our marriage, and everything we built together. I won't be made a fool of in my own home." For a moment, Ethan looked like he was going to argue, but then he seemed to think better of it. Without another word, he walked past me toward the bedroom, leaving me standing in the living room, shaking with anger and grief. As I listened to the sound of him packing, my emotions swirled into a chaotic storm. I wanted to cry, to scream, to throw something. But instead I stood there, gripping the edge of the couch until my knuckles turned white. When he finally left, the sound of the door closing behind him was both a relief and a dagger to the heart. The house was silent now, painfully so, and I sank onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. My life had just changed forever. Part 3: The Breaking Point. The house felt unbearably empty after Ethan left. His absence was a hollow void that echoed with the memories of what once was. Lazy Sunday mornings spent tangled in sheets, the sound of his laughter filling the room during our inside jokes, even the petty arguments over which Netflix show to binge. Now all of it felt like a cruel joke. I stayed on the couch for hours, staring blankly at the wall. The weight of everything pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. I thought back to the confrontation, replaying it in my mind like a broken record. Could I have handled it differently? Should I have waited? Was I too quick to pull the trigger? But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the texts, the emojis, the winks, the plans for wine. It was undeniable. Ethan had betrayed me, even if he didn't go through with it. And betrayal, no matter how small, cut deep. The next morning I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, But instead of its usual warmth, it felt like a spotlight exposing my raw, vulnerable state. The bed felt unnaturally large without Ethan. His side was untouched, the pillow still dented from his head. It was a jarring reminder of his absence but also of his choice. I forced myself out of bed and into the shower, letting the water scald my skin in hopes it would wash away the ache in my chest. But it didn't. As I stood there letting the water run over me, a million thoughts swirled in my head. What if he came back, begging for forgiveness? What if he didn't come back at all? By midday I realized I couldn't sit in silence anymore. The house felt suffocating, every corner filled with reminders of Ethan. The mug he left on the kitchen counter, the hoodie draped over the back of a chair, the faint scent of his cologne in the bedroom. I needed an escape. I called my best friend, Sarah. "Can you come over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, what's wrong?" she asked immediately, concern thick in her tone. "Just please," I said, unable to explain through the lump in my throat. Within an hour, Sarah was at my doorstep, armed with wine, takeout, and the kind of unwavering support only a best friend could offer. As soon as I saw her, I crumbled, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. She pulled me into a tight hug. "What happened?" Between sobs, I told her everything. The texts, the confrontation, Ethan's deflection, and his eventual departure. By the time I finished, my voice was hoarse, and my chest felt like it had been wrung dry. "That bastard," Sarah said, her eyes flashing with anger. "How dare he? After everything you've done for him." I nodded, wiping my face with the sleeve of my sweatshirt. I don't know what to do now. How do I even start to pick up the pieces?" Sarah handed me a glass of wine and sat down beside me. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said gently. "But you did the right thing, Claire. You stood up for yourself. You deserve better than someone who makes you question your worth." Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the gnawing ache in my chest. That night after Sarah left, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of Ethan and me from happier times. Vacations, birthdays, silly selfies. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. How had we gone from that to this? The worst part was the nagging feeling that I'd missed the signs. Was it the late nights at work? The sudden increase in business trips? The way he'd been so distant lately? I'd chalked it all up to stress, to the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But now looking back, it all felt like glaring red flags I'd ignored. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When I finally drifted off, it was only to be haunted by dreams of Ethan and Lily, their flirtatious messages playing on a loop. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't let this consume me. If Ethan wanted to play the victim and twist the narrative, so be it. I wasn't going to beg or plead for his loyalty. I deserved better, and it was time I started acting like it. I spent the day packing up his things. Every shirt, every pair of shoes, every reminder of him went into boxes. It was cathartic in a way, like reclaiming my space, my home, my life. By the time I finished, the house looked different, emptier, yes, but also less tainted. When Ethan texted that evening, asking if he could come by to pick up some of his things, I didn't respond. Instead, I left the boxes on the porch with a simple note. "Your stuff is outside. Don't come in. Claire." It wasn't just about kicking Ethan out of the house. It was about kicking him out of my heart, out of the narrative he'd twisted to suit his own selfish actions. This was my breaking point, and I wasn't going to let him break me any further. As I stood by the window watching him silently load the boxes into his car, a strange sense of calm washed over me. It hurt, yes, but it also felt like the first step towards something new, something better. What steps do you think were most important in Claire's journey to rebuild her life after the betrayal? Part 4. Picking up the pieces. The first morning after Ethan left felt surreal. The silence in the house was deafening, every empty space a reminder of what was missing. I spent hours wandering from room to room, unsure of how to start putting myself back together. Work became my escape. I arrived early, stayed late, and buried myself in tasks that demanded just enough focus to keep the pain at bay. Sarah, my best friend and coworker, wasn't fooled. One evening, she caught me at my desk long after everyone had gone. "Claire, you can't work your way through this," she said, closing my laptop with a pointed look. Her words hit harder than I expected, and I broke down. It was the first time I let myself feel the full weight of the heartbreak. And while it hurt, it was also freeing. The weekends were harder. Long stretches of time with no distractions. I dug through old photos and mementos, each one tugging at memories of what I thought we had. But as painful as it was, I started to see that I hadn't been truly happy in a long time. Slowly, I began to reclaim my life. I joined a yoga class, reconnected with old friends, and even let Sarah drag me to a pottery workshop. Shaping clay felt oddly therapeutic, like I was creating something new out of the mess. One evening, Ethan texted, "I miss you. Can we talk?" My heart raced as I stared at the message, torn between nostalgia and the newfound strength I'd started to build. I deleted the text and blocked his number. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. That night, as I sipped wine and watched the sunset from my newly rearranged living room, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was healing. I didn't need Ethan to feel whole. This was my new beginning. Do you think Claire made the right decision in refusing to give Ethan another chance? Why or why not? Part 5, a new chapter. Weeks turned into months and slowly, the raw wound left by Ethan's betrayal began to scar over. Life didn't feel normal yet, but it felt lighter. I started to carve out a version of myself that wasn't tied to him. Someone who wasn't defined by being a wife, but simply by being me. Work became more than a distraction. It became a source of pride. I began taking on new challenges, ones I'd previously shied away from. My boss even commented on my newfound focus, offering me a leadership role on a major project. It felt good to be recognized for something outside of my personal life, to feel valued for my abilities. But the evenings were still a struggle. The quiet moments when the house seemed too big and too empty left space for the doubts to creep in. Was I truly better off? Would I ever find someone who loved me the way I thought Ethan did? One night, as I sat flipping through streaming options, I received a message from an old college friend, Mark. "Hey Claire, it's been ages. How are you?" It was casual, almost innocent, but it caught me off guard. Mark and I had been close during school, sharing late-night study sessions and the occasional heart-to-heart over beers. We'd lost touch over the years, and seeing his name brought back a wave of nostalgia. We started texting, at first reminiscing about old times and mutual friends. But soon, our conversations became more personal. He asked how I was doing, and for the first time in months, I opened up about what had happened with Ethan. "I'm so sorry you went through that," he replied. "You didn't deserve it. For what it's worth, I always thought you were way too good for him." His words made me smile, but they also reminded me of the person I used to be. The confident, ambitious woman who didn't settle for less than she deserved. Over the next few weeks, Mark and I talked regularly. He was living a few hours away but mentioned he'd be in town soon and suggested grabbing coffee. The idea of meeting him both excited and terrified me. I wasn't sure I was ready for anything new, but I also wasn't sure I wanted to keep living in the shadow of my past. When the day of our coffee meetup arrived, I spent more time than I'd like to admit picking out an outfit. It wasn't a date, I told myself. Just two old friends catching up. But as I sat across from him at the cafe, laughing over shared memories and trading updates on our lives, I couldn't ignore the flutter of something new. Mark was different from Ethan. Easygoing, kind, and genuine in a way that felt refreshing. He didn't press me for details about my marriage or try to offer solutions. He just listened, offering quiet support and the occasional joke to lighten the mood. As we walked out of the cafe, he turned to me with a smile. "I'm glad we reconnected, Claire. You've been through a lot, but it's clear you're stronger than ever." His words stayed with me long after he left. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not as someone broken or betrayed, but as someone who was rebuilding. That evening I stood in my living room, looking at the space I'd worked so hard to make my own. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. Instead, they felt like a blank canvas, ready for whatever I chose to paint on them next. Mark wasn't the answer to my pain, and I knew better than to rush into anything new. But he was a reminder that life didn't have to end with Ethan. It could grow, evolve, and surprise me in ways I hadn't expected. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The ache in my chest wasn't completely gone. It might never fully leave, but it was quieter now, replaced by a tentative hope. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was the start of a story I was finally writing for myself. Part 6. standing strong. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I ran into Ethan again. I hadn't seen or heard from him since the night he packed his things and left. I'd worked hard to rebuild my life in his absence, and I thought I was finally free of the tangled emotions he'd left behind. But there he was, standing by the frozen foods aisle of the grocery store, holding a bag of peas like we hadn't just spent 7 years building and then destroying a life together. He looked up and froze when he saw me, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that almost resembled guilt. For a moment we just stared at each other, the hum of the freezers and the chatter of nearby shoppers the only sounds around us. "Claire," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, cautious. "Ethan," I replied, my tone cool and steady. He took a tentative step toward me, leaving the peas forgotten in his cart. "You look good," he said, his eyes searching my face. "Thanks," I said shortly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his words rattled me. "I've been thinking about you," he continued, his voice low. "About us." I raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" He nodded, looking down at the floor for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "I made a mistake, Claire. I see that now. I miss you, everything about you. I've been miserable without you." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. There was a time when I might have melted at hearing him admit he was wrong, when I might have welcomed him back with open arms. But that time was gone. "You miss me," I repeated, my voice steady but sharp. "Is that before or after you started texting other women?" Ethan flinched at the reminder, his face clouding with regret. "I was an idiot," he admitted. "I didn't realize what I had until I lost it. But I'm different now, Claire. I've changed. I want to make things right." For a moment I let his words sink in. I studied his face, searching for some hint of the man I used to love. But all I saw was the same Ethan who had shattered my trust. "I'm glad you've had time to think," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "But I've changed too. And I'm not interested in going backward." His eyes widened in surprise. "You're really not going to give me another chance?" "No, Ethan," I said, shaking my head. "You had your chance and you threw it away. I've worked too hard to rebuild my life to let you waltz back in and tear it apart again." He opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he nodded slowly, the defeat in his posture unmistakable. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Claire. For everything." Without another word he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the aisle. As I watched him go, I felt a surprising sense of relief. The encounter could have reopened old wounds, but instead it reaffirmed how far I'd come. Later that evening I sat on my balcony, sipping a glass of wine as the city lights twinkled in the distance. My life wasn't perfect, and I still had moments of doubt and loneliness, but I was no longer defined by what Ethan had done to me. I had chosen to stand strong, to build a life I was proud of, and that was worth more than any fleeting apology. As the cool breeze brushed my face, I smiled to myself, knowing I had finally closed the door on that chapter of my life. Have you ever had to let go of someone who hurt you deeply, and how did you find the strength to move on?